Louise Peete wasn't born into darkness. She built it around herself, brick by deceitful brick. Her story isn't one of survival. It's one of control, seduction, and a mind so cold it could turn love into a weapon. From genteel beginnings to the smoky underbelly of Los Angeles' South Side, she wore innocence like a mask, and underneath it, the devil smiled. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic tales from the shadows of history, where power, greed, and blood tell the truest stories of all. They say evil doesn't always come with a snarl. Sometimes it comes with a smile so soft, so inviting, you never see the knife until it's already buried deep. In the heart of turn-of-the-century Louisiana, a young girl named Louise Peete learned early that charm could be sharper than any blade. Her story doesn't begin in the alleys of crime or the dens of gangsters. It begins in parlors filled with soft laughter and genteel manners, where money whispered and reputation was everything. But behind her eyes, those deep knowing eyes, there was a hunger that no amount of luxury could ever feed. Louise was born in 1880, into comfort, but not warmth. The South was rebuilding after its wounds, and families like hers clung to refinement as if politeness could cover the cracks. Her father was a businessman, her mother a proper lady obsessed with appearances. From an early age, Louise learned that beauty and behavior were currencies, and she spent them lavishly. Teachers remembered her as charming, quick-witted, maybe too quick. Friends remembered her laughter, bright and hollow. But those who crossed her, they remembered her eyes, cold, calculating, unforgiving. She wasn't content with being another Southern debutante waiting for marriage to dictate her future. No, Louise wanted control, power, the kind that came from knowing how to read a person, how to twist their wants and weaknesses until they bent to her will. Even as a teenager, she practiced this art like a pianist learning scales. A smile here, a lie there, a touch, a compliment, a tear, each one carefully chosen, rehearsed, and deployed. By the time she reached her 20s, she had already left behind the lace and courtesy of her upbringing. She had tasted the wider world, and it had tasted her back. Her beauty was undeniable, but it wasn't soft. It was dangerous, like fire reflected on glass. Men were drawn to her, not realizing they were moths heading toward their own burning. Louise saw them not as lovers, but as opportunities. She understood that a man's ego was the easiest lock to pick, and she had the perfect set of tools: flattery, empathy, and the illusion of innocence. But charm can be a weapon that dulls with overuse. And soon Louise would find herself standing at a crossroads where seduction alone couldn't buy safety. Her first marriage was to a man named Henry Peete, a salesman with ambition, but no real power. To Louise, he was a stepping stone, one she could use to climb higher. Their life together was a portrait of Southern respectability on the surface, but the cracks beneath told another story. Henry adored her. She tolerated him. He brought home paychecks. She brought home secrets. Louise couldn't stand the monotony of domestic life. She wanted movement, excitement, the glittering edge of risk. Rumors began to swirl. Small lies here and there about money missing, flirtations with wealthy men, strange letters arriving under other names. She dismissed them all with tears or laughter, whichever suited the moment. And Henry, blinded by love, chose to believe her. But faith can only survive so many fractures. When Henry lost his job, Louise didn't comfort him. Instead, she disappeared for days at a time, reappearing with expensive trinkets and vague explanations. She was already living a double life, one foot in the drawing room, the other in the shadows. People whispered that she had friends among gamblers, con men, maybe even small-time gangsters. Whatever the truth, money seemed to follow her like a loyal dog, and just as quickly vanish when she was done with it. Then came the scandal. A man was found dead, shot in what was rumored to be a lover's quarrel. The whispers turned into accusations, and Louise found herself surrounded by suspicion. But she was too clever to be caught. She cried, she played the victim, and once again, society looked away. The police couldn't prove anything. There was no weapon, no witnesses. Just Louise standing there with her angelic face and trembling voice, saying she had been terrified for her life. She left Louisiana soon after, her name tainted but her spirit unbroken. California called to her, a place of reinvention, where past sins could be washed away under the golden sun. But Louise didn't go west to start over. She went there to expand. The train that carried her to Los Angeles might as well have been a chariot into destiny. She arrived with little more than a suitcase and her well-honed mask of charm. The city was alive with ambition, oil barons, real estate kings, and the rising glitter of Hollywood money. It was a place where everyone was pretending to be something they weren't. For Louise, that made it paradise. She slipped into high society with ease, introducing herself as a widow, a tragic, beautiful woman alone in the world. Her grief made her irresistible. Men saw a delicate soul. Women saw someone elegant and trustworthy. And beneath it all, Louise was watching, learning, calculating. She understood that in a city of dreams, the best liars thrived. She rented rooms in grand houses, always with wealthy landlords, often elderly or lonely. And time after time, those people seemed to meet misfortune. Some disappeared, others died mysteriously. But Louise always survived, always moved on, always smiling. Back in those early days, before her name became infamous, she could still pass as just another socialite trying to rebuild her life. But in the quiet corners of the South Side, whispers began to follow her. Stories of people who trusted her and lost everything. Stories of missing jewelry, missing fortunes, missing lives. Louise had begun to weave her web, one silken thread at a time. To the outside world, she was polite, graceful, refined. But beneath that charm, there was something much darker. A mind that saw empathy as weakness, trust as opportunity, and murder as merely a means to an end. Every move she made was deliberate, every relationship a performance. Her voice could soothe or sting. Her words could heal or destroy. And when the time came to choose between survival and morality, Louise Peete never hesitated. By now, the seeds of her legend had been planted. The woman who could charm anyone. The widow who always seemed to benefit from tragedy. The queen of the South Side, though the crown she wore was invisible, built from lies, deceit, and blood. And yet this was only the beginning. The true depth of her darkness had yet to surface. Because in the years to come, Louise Peete would rise higher than anyone expected, living among the rich, mingling with the powerful, and leaving a trail of ruin behind her. Her beauty would be her weapon. Her intelligence, her armor, and her victims. They would never see her coming. This was no ordinary criminal. This was a woman who made death look like an accident, and betrayal feel like love. Los Angeles in the early 1900s was a city of facades, sunshine on the surface, shadows underneath. It glittered with wealth and ambition. But behind every manicured lawn and polished car was someone desperate to climb higher, to hide their sins, or to forget where they came from. Louise Peete understood that world perfectly. It wasn't about truth or virtue. It was about appearance, and she could play that game better than anyone. When she first arrived, she carried herself like a woman born to money, though her purse was almost empty. Her voice had that soft southern drawl, gentle and disarming, a sound that wrapped around people like silk. She rented a small room in a grand Los Angeles home, presenting herself as a widow still mourning her late husband. Her black dresses and quiet demeanor made her seem tragic, even pure. Society welcomed her, because tragedy, when worn beautifully, was something to admire. Louise began attending luncheons, charity events, and garden parties. She had a gift for finding the right people, wealthy widows, lonely men, women of influence who needed a friend to listen. She played the part so well that even the sharpest eyes never caught the flicker of calculation behind her smile. But beneath her gentle facade, she was studying her surroundings, reading every gesture, every glance. She knew who was generous, who was gullible, and who had something worth taking. Her first real mark in California was a wealthy man named Jacob Denton, a silver mine owner with more fortune than family. He was older, proud, and isolated, the perfect prey for a woman like Louise. Their first meeting was accidental, or at least it appeared so. She brushed past him at a hotel gathering, apologized with a soft laugh, and within moments had his attention. Denton was charmed by her modesty, her delicate way of speaking, her tragic story of loss. She told him she had come west to rebuild her life after her husband's untimely death. Every word was a thread in the web she spun, and Denton walked straight into it. In the weeks that followed, she became a frequent guest in his home. She flattered him without seeming to. She cooked for him, listened to his stories, even offered advice on his business affairs. Denton, who had grown suspicious of fortune seekers, found himself trusting her completely. She had a way of making people feel seen, understood, even cherished. But to Louise, it was all performance. Every kind gesture was a step toward control. Neighbors began to notice her presence at the Denton residence, always arriving at odd hours, always dressed impeccably. Some said they looked like lovers. Others whispered that she was managing his household, but no one dared to question it outright. Denton was private, and Louise was respectable. Then one day, Jacob Denton vanished. Louise told everyone he had gone on a business trip to Mexico. She even showed letters, supposedly written by him, saying he would be away for months. She dismissed his absence with calm confidence, assuring anyone who asked that he was perfectly fine. In the meantime, she moved into his home to look after it until his return. Weeks turned into months, and still, Denton did not return. Louise entertained guests, threw small dinners, and continued living off his fortune as though nothing had happened. The neighbors were puzzled, but her composure was unshakable. There was no panic, no sign of distress. She kept the curtains drawn in certain rooms, claiming the sun damaged the furniture. Behind one of those closed doors, however, lay a horrifying secret. Jacob Denton hadn't gone to Mexico. He hadn't written those letters. He was dead, buried right beneath the house he once owned. Shot, sealed away, and forgotten by everyone except the woman who had orchestrated it all. But even murder didn't rattle Louise Peete. She continued her act flawlessly, moving through society as if she were still the grieving widow she pretended to be. For a time, her plan worked perfectly. She enjoyed Denton's wealth, wore his jewelry, and played hostess in his mansion. Guests marveled at her elegance, her poise. No one could imagine the truth. It wasn't until months later that the mask began to slip. Denton's acquaintances grew suspicious. The letters she showed seemed too neat, too carefully written. And when police began to ask questions, her story began to unravel. She told them Denton was alive, that he had simply chosen to leave the country for business. Her performance was as smooth as ever, but this time the detectives weren't buying it. They pressed harder, and cracks began to show. She stumbled over dates, contradicted herself, and finally, reluctantly, admitted she didn't know where he was. The search of the house revealed the truth. Beneath a freshly cemented patch in the basement, they found Jacob Denton's body. The city erupted in shock. The beautiful widow, the charming socialite who moved so gracefully among them, was suddenly the face of evil. Newspapers called her the woman without a conscience. Reporters wrote about her eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes that never seemed to show fear or regret. Louise was arrested, but even then she didn't panic. She denied everything, blaming an unknown intruder. In court, she played the part of the wronged woman once again, soft-spoken, tearful, fragile. Her lawyers painted her as a victim of circumstance, and somehow, incredibly, the jury hesitated. There wasn't enough hard evidence to prove she pulled the trigger herself. She was convicted not of murder, but of lesser charges. Her sentence was shorter than anyone expected, and when she walked out of prison years later, she was smiling. Most people, after such a scandal, would hide in shame. But Louise wasn't most people. She changed her name, changed her story, and started over. She returned to the south side of Los Angeles, the place that had once embraced her, and began weaving her web again. It was as if nothing had happened. She still had the same charm, the same soft voice that made people lower their guard. Even those who knew her history couldn't quite resist her pull. She would sit at a table, look into your eyes, and make you believe she was harmless, that she was misunderstood. And for many, that was enough. Louise Peete's first deception had ended in blood, but it had also taught her something crucial. She could get away with anything, as long as she played her role right. People didn't want to believe that evil could look like her. They needed to see monsters as obvious, wild-eyed, angry, dangerous. But Louise, she was none of those things. She was calm, refined, pleasant. Her evil was polite, and that was what made her unstoppable. After the Denton affair, she drifted from city to city, changing names, changing lovers, always landing on her feet. Wherever she went, misfortune seemed to follow. Men ruined, women vanished, fortunes drained. And when suspicion grew too heavy, she vanished too, like smoke in the wind. By the time the decade turned, she had become an urban legend whispered among detectives. The Widow Peete, they called her, the woman who smiled as others disappeared. Some believed she'd left the country. Others swore they'd seen her in new neighborhoods, mingling with new victims. But no one could ever hold her long enough to stop her. She was a ghost in a silk dress, haunting Los Angeles with elegance and malice. And deep inside, Louise Peete knew one thing for certain: her game wasn't over. It was only evolving. By the time the Roaring Twenties began to hum through the streets of Los Angeles, Louise Peete had reinvented herself yet again. The years had softened nothing in her. If anything, they had sharpened her edges, refined her darkness into something far more dangerous. She no longer needed to pretend she was fragile. She had learned to weaponize her confidence. In a city obsessed with appearances, she was a masterpiece, poised, graceful, and untouchable. The Great War had left behind a generation searching for escape. Men came home broken, women discovered independence, and everyone wanted to forget. Los Angeles became the dreamland for those chasing second chances. And in that glittering chaos, Louise thrived. She moved through the city like a shadow in pearls, always appearing where money and loneliness met. She found work, or so she claimed, as a house manager. Sometimes a companion, sometimes an advisor for wealthy widows and aging businessmen. But her real talent lay not in management, but manipulation. She knew how to make herself indispensable, how to become the one person her employers couldn't imagine living without. And once they trusted her completely, she'd tighten the noose. Her charm was no longer soft and girlish. Now it was elegant, practiced, the kind that made people feel privileged just to be in her presence. She wore diamonds like armor, her hair in perfect waves, her smile composed to the millimeter. But beneath that polished exterior, her heart remained as cold as ever. She didn't crave affection or companionship. She craved control. Her newest venture came in 1920, when she met a woman named Emily Latham, a wealthy widow whose husband had left behind a fortune and a sprawling estate. Emily was kind but naive, the sort of woman who believed the best in everyone. Louise saw that softness and knew exactly how to use it. She became Emily's confidant, her dear friend. They shared tea in the afternoons, laughter in the evenings, and secrets in the dark hours between. Louise told her tales of hardship and loss, lies spun so delicately that Emily wept for her. Within months, Emily trusted Louise completely, granting her access to accounts, letters, even property. It was a familiar dance, one Louise had perfected long ago. And like all her dances, it ended in silence. When Emily's family tried to contact her, Louise claimed she had gone away to recover from an illness. Weeks passed, then months. Louise handled her mail, managed her estate, and continued to live there as though she owned it. By the time questions became too loud to ignore, Emily was already gone, erased without a trace. Authorities would later piece together fragments of evidence, odd financial transfers, witnesses who swore they saw Louise alone in the house, a note supposedly written by Emily in a hand that didn't quite look right. But for years, no one could prove what happened. Louise had covered her tracks too well, her lies layered like fine silk. This pattern repeated itself again and again. Wherever she went, people vanished, fortunes shifted, and Louise emerged untouched. To the public, she was a respectable woman who'd endured much sorrow. To detectives, she was a ghost wrapped in satin, always one step ahead. In the smoky parlors of the South Side, she became something of a legend. Bartenders whispered her name like a curse. Men who thought they could outsmart her ended up broke, disgraced, or worse. Some said she had connections with the city's criminal underbelly, with gamblers, fencemen, even corrupt officers who helped her slip away when things got too close. Others believed she didn't need help at all, that her greatest ally was her own audacity. One story that made its way through police files spoke of a man named Richard Keene, a real estate investor who fell under her spell. He was successful, charming, and newly single, exactly the type she could mold. Louise met him at a dinner party, dressed in silver satin that shimmered under the light like quicksilver. By the end of the night, he was smitten. Within weeks, she was his confidant. Within months, she was his ruin. Keene confided in her about his deals, his investments, his secrets. She listened with perfect attention, offering advice that seemed wise and selfless. But behind the scenes, she was redirecting his assets, arranging sales he never authorized, and siphoning money through accounts only she controlled. When he finally confronted her, she didn't argue or deny. She wept. She spoke of misunderstanding, of love, of betrayal. And in his confusion, he hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything. By the time Keene realized the depth of her deception, it was too late. His finances were in ruins, his reputation shattered. Louise, of course, moved on. She left behind just enough charm to make him doubt himself, just enough warmth to make him wonder if maybe, somehow, it had all been a mistake. She had become an expert in psychological warfare. She didn't need guns or violence. Her weapon was her mind, her ability to read people so deeply that she could rewrite their beliefs. And the more she succeeded, the more fearless she became. By the mid-1920s, Louise Peete was living better than she ever had. She dined with the wealthy, vacationed in seaside resorts, and attended high society galas under new names. Sometimes she was Mrs. Banning, sometimes Louise Glenn, sometimes just the widow from the South. Each name was a new mask, each identity a clean slate. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, a phantom wrapped in luxury. But success has a way of breeding carelessness. And Louise, for all her cunning, began to believe her own legend. She saw herself as untouchable, above law, above consequence, above morality itself. She thought of the people she deceived as weak, as foolish. To her, their downfall was not cruelty, but justice, the natural order of things. Yet, in quiet moments when the music faded and the champagne went flat, she sometimes felt something creeping in, not guilt, but fear. Fear of losing control, fear of exposure. She'd wake at night and stare into the darkness, listening for footsteps that weren't there. Because no matter how carefully she covered her tracks, she knew that the past had a way of finding its way back. The detectives who had once investigated the Jacob Denton case never forgot her. Some had retired, some had died, but their notes remained. And in those yellowing pages, the same name appeared again and again, Louise Peete. Still, she danced on, living as though life itself bowed to her will. When people whispered about the mysterious deaths that followed her, she laughed them off. Coincidence, she'd say, her voice sweet as honey. People are always looking for someone to blame. But the truth was beginning to close in. Her charm, once flawless, was starting to crack. Age had softened her beauty, but not her ambition. The world around her was changing. Gangsters ruled the nightclubs. Prohibition brought new money, and women like her were no longer unseen. The more she reached for power, the more visible she became. And soon, visibility would be her undoing. Louise Peete had built her empire on lies, seduction, and the quiet certainty that no one could touch her. But behind her perfect smile, the storm was already gathering. The detectives were watching. The past was whispering. And one day soon, the Queen of the South Side would find that even the most beautiful web can't hold forever. By the late 1930s, the world had changed. But Louise Peete hadn't. The flapper era had faded. The Great Depression had left scars across the country. And the glamour of old Los Angeles was beginning to crack. But Louise, ever the actress, still moved through it as though time itself bowed to her. She was older now, but she wore age like another disguise. The curls in her hair were softer, the rouge on her cheeks a touch heavier, but her eyes, those cold, watchful eyes, hadn't lost their edge. The city, however, was no longer as forgiving. The South Side wasn't a playground for dreamers anymore. It was a hunting ground. The streets she once glided through were filled with broken men, desperate families, and eyes that had learned not to trust too easily. Even the upper crust, the widows and gentlemen who once adored her, had become wary of kindness. People were struggling to survive, and pity was in short supply. For the first time in years, Louise Peete found herself working harder to keep up the act. Her latest opportunity came from tragedy, as it often did. An old acquaintance, Frances Craig, had recently lost her husband and needed help managing her home. Frances was gentle, generous, and lonely. She had a large house, a modest inheritance, and a heart far too open for a city like Los Angeles. When Louise showed up at her door, impeccably dressed and softly spoken, claiming to be looking for honest work, Frances saw not danger, but grace. She invited her in without hesitation. It didn't take long for Louise to make herself indispensable. She cooked, cleaned, and soothed Frances's grief with warm tea and carefully chosen words. She listened as Frances cried over her husband, offering sympathy that sounded so sincere it made even the neighbors praise her kindness. But behind every comforting gesture, Louise was calculating. She watched Frances's habits, noted her bank statements, memorized the layout of the house. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle she was assembling, the puzzle that would once again place her at the center of someone else's fortune. The transformation was subtle. First, Louise began handling Frances's correspondence. Then the household accounts. Soon she was running everything. She made herself the protector, the caretaker, the one person Frances couldn't live without. But in truth, Frances had already signed her own death warrant the day she opened her door to Louise Peete. The murder was as cruel as it was precise. One night, under the warm hum of the city lights, Frances Craig disappeared. Louise told the neighbors she had gone east to visit family, then claimed she had received a letter saying Frances was delayed. The story changed with each telling, but her confidence never wavered. She even hired a gardener and a handyman to maintain the property, explaining that Mrs. Craig wanted things kept tidy for her return, but the truth lay buried, literally, beneath that very garden. Louise had done it again. Another friend, another life snuffed out, another home claimed. She moved into the Craig residence, living as though it were hers. She took Frances's jewelry, wore her clothes, entertained guests under her roof. To anyone who asked, she was looking after things. To those who knew her past, the pattern was chillingly familiar, and this time, it didn't go unnoticed. One of the new workers on the property, a man named Arthur Logan, began to suspect something was wrong. He noticed how Louise avoided certain parts of the yard, how she never seemed to receive mail addressed to Frances, how she dodged questions about when Mrs. Craig was coming home. At first he kept quiet. Louise had a way of making people doubt their instincts. But as the weeks passed, Arthur's unease grew, then came the smell. It was faint at first, but impossible to ignore. The workers mentioned it to Louise, and she brushed it off with a laugh. "Old pipes," she said. "This house has been here for decades." But when Arthur finally reported it to the police, everything began to unravel. Detectives arrived at the Craig home on a gray morning in 1944. Louise greeted them calmly, as if their visit were a social call. She offered tea, smiled politely, and denied everything. But beneath the floorboards of the garage, buried in a shallow grave, they found the decomposing body of Frances Craig. This time, there was no escape. Louise Peete was arrested on the spot, her composure never breaking. As they led her away, reporters gathered, shouting her name. The flash of cameras caught her face, still serene, still painted, still wearing that faint smile that had destroyed so many lives. One journalist later wrote, "She looked less like a killer and more like a woman on her way to a luncheon." Her trial became one of the most sensational in California history. The courtroom was packed with spectators, hungry to see the Queen of the South Side brought to justice. The prosecutors painted her as a predator, a woman who moved through life, feeding on the trust of others. The defense tried to spin her as misunderstood, a victim of circumstance, but the evidence was overwhelming. Letters forged in Frances's name, bank withdrawals traced to Louise, witness testimonies. Every piece pointed to her guilt, yet through it all, Louise sat still. She didn't flinch at the photographs. She didn't cry when the verdict was read. She looked straight ahead, her expression calm, as if she were already somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the reach of the courtroom's judgment. The jury took just over an hour to find her guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, death. When the verdict was announced, a hush fell over the room. Louise showed no emotion. She simply nodded once, as if confirming a decision she already knew was coming. Reporters later described it as the coldest moment in the history of California justice. In the days that followed, the press couldn't get enough of her story. The papers called her the Smiling Widow, the Velvet Executioner, and, most famously, the Queen of the South Side. Her past crimes resurfaced in every headline. The Denton murder, the vanished widows, the trail of death that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It was as though the ghosts of her victims had finally found their voices, speaking through ink and newsprint. From her cell, Louise remained unbothered. She refused to speak of guilt, refused to apologize. When asked if she felt remorse, she tilted her head and said softly, "I've never done anything I couldn't live with." Her calm terrified people more than her crimes, but for all her poise, time was no longer her ally. The empire she'd built, the lies, the money, the charm, crumbled around her. The friends who once defended her now distanced themselves. The men who adored her spoke of her like a curse they had narrowly escaped. And as the date of her execution drew near, even she couldn't ignore the silence that settled in the dark corners of her cell. It was the silence of an empire collapsing, not with a scream, but with a whisper. On the day of her execution, she dressed carefully. Her hair was neat, her lipstick perfect. When asked if she had any last words, she smiled that same calm smile and said, "No, I'm ready." And with that, Louise Peete, the woman who had turned deception into an art form, met the one thing she could never manipulate: the end. But legends never really die. Even after her death, the whispers continued. Some claimed to see her ghost near the Craig residence. Others swore that her story served as a warning to those who trusted too easily. The Queen of the South Side was gone, but her shadow still lingered, etched into the city that had once adored her, feared her, and finally condemned her. Before her name was whispered in courtrooms and printed in headlines, before the police ever dug up what she tried to bury, Louise Peete had already mastered the art of resurrection. Prison, disgrace, exposure, none of it could hold her for long. Each time the world caught a glimpse of her true face, she simply built a new one. And in the years following her first downfall, she became something even more dangerous than before. A woman who understood that her greatest power wasn't violence, but reinvention. When she was released from her first prison sentence in the late 1920s, Los Angeles was pulsing with new energy. The city had grown hungrier, faster, dirtier. The stock market boom filled the air with champagne dreams, and the movie industry painted lies in gold. Louise stepped back into this world not as a broken woman, but as one reborn. She told anyone who asked that she'd been away caring for a sick relative, her voice so sweet and convincing that even the most skeptical nodded in pity. Gone was the haunted widow. In her place was a dignified, mature woman, composed, polite, seemingly wise from suffering. She wore black not as mourning, but as style. She'd become the sort of woman others trusted instinctively, a quiet matron who knew how to keep secrets. But beneath that calm surface, her hunger hadn't faded. It had evolved. She no longer sought quick cons or petty scams. Now she wanted permanence, respectability, an empire built not on one house or one husband, but on an entire life she could control. To build that, she needed allies. She began networking in the places where appearances mattered most: church socials, charity luncheons, and genteel community circles. The people there loved a story of redemption, and Louise knew exactly how to give them one. She spoke softly about how she'd made mistakes in her youth, how she'd learned the value of honesty and faith. Her listeners didn't see a criminal. They saw a survivor. One of those listeners was Margaret Logan, a kind woman married to a respectable man named Arthur Logan. The Logans were well-liked and modestly wealthy, the sort of couple who believed in second chances. When they met Louise, they were drawn in by her grace. She seemed cultured, well-spoken, the kind of woman who could add refinement to their lives. When she mentioned she was looking for work as a housekeeper or secretary, they didn't hesitate. Louise moved into the Logan household as if she'd always belonged there. She cooked, cleaned, and took care of Margaret with devotion so convincing that it disarmed even Arthur. To the neighbors, she was an angel. To the Logans, she became family. And to herself, she was finally back in command. She began weaving her influence slowly, skillfully. Margaret was frail, often sick, and relied heavily on Louise's help. The more she needed, the more control Louise gained. Arthur, meanwhile, was busy with work, leaving the household's day-to-day affairs in Louise's capable hands. It was a perfect setup, one that allowed her to manipulate finances, correspondence, and relationships without raising a single eyebrow. This was the phoenix stage of her life, the point where she truly believed she could shed her past entirely. No longer the hunted widow, no longer the accused. She told herself she was simply taking what she deserved. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every calculated act, she justified them as payment for a world that had wronged her. For a while, it worked, but the past doesn't die just because you bury it. And in the city she had once conquered, there were still those who remembered her name. A detective named Klein, who had worked the Denton case decades earlier, never stopped following her story. He was old now, close to retirement, but he had never forgotten the woman who'd walked free while others lay in graves. When word reached him of a new widow's companion named Louise Peete living in South Los Angeles, something in his gut told him it was no coincidence. He began digging quietly. He asked questions. He checked records. And the more he found, the more he realized she hadn't changed. Different victims. Same pattern. Back in the Logan home, however, Louise sensed the world shifting again. Margaret's health worsened, and with it came opportunity. Louise offered to take over the household finances temporarily until Margaret recovered. Arthur agreed. He was too preoccupied to notice the subtle changes in their accounts. Then, one winter night, tragedy struck. Margaret was found dead in her bedroom. Peaceful, they said, a heart attack. Arthur was devastated, inconsolable. But Louise was calm, practical, even comforting. She handled the funeral arrangements, spoke to neighbors, and reassured everyone that Margaret's passing had been God's will. It might have ended there. Another death in her wake, another fortune quietly siphoned. But fate, this time, was less forgiving. Arthur Logan began to notice small inconsistencies. Letters missing from his wife's desk, bank withdrawals she couldn't have made, insurance policies suddenly altered. When he confronted Louise, she played her usual part. Tears, hurt, confusion. "I only did what Margaret asked," she said. And for a moment he believed her. But suspicion, once planted, doesn't fade. Arthur started keeping watch. He saw how often Louise visited the bank, how she intercepted mail, how she avoided certain questions. And one morning, he disappeared. Neighbors were told he'd gone to San Francisco on business. Louise said it so casually, so convincingly, that no one thought to question it. But weeks passed, then months, and Arthur never returned. This time, her lies began to fray faster. The neighbors noticed odd smells near the garden. The gardener quit abruptly, muttering about something wrong with the house. And when one of Arthur's relatives came looking for him, Louise's composure began to slip. The police were called. And just as before, just as with Jacob Denton, just as with Francis Craig, they found the truth beneath the ground. Arthur Logan had been shot, his body buried in the backyard of his own home. And living in that home, attending church every Sunday, smiling at neighbors as though nothing had happened, was Louise Peete. When they came for her this time, she didn't fight. She didn't run. She didn't even blink. "I didn't kill anyone," she said softly, her voice calm and familiar. "I only tried to help." But the city had grown wise to her charm. The newspapers didn't call her a victim now. They called her a monster. The story of the Phoenix of Los Angeles turned to ash in front of her eyes. Still, even in custody, she never lost her poise. Reporters described her as eerily serene, a woman who smiled as if the gallows were a minor inconvenience. And in a way, maybe they were. Louise Peete had lived her life on borrowed time. Every lie, every murder, every escape, each had bought her another day. Now those days were finally running out. She would face trial again. She would hear the word guilty again. But for Louise Peete, there was a twisted sense of pride in it. She had outsmarted the world for decades. She had played her part to perfection. And even as she waited in her cell, she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, someone out there still believed her. Because that was her true genius. Even when the truth was staring people in the face, Louise Peete could still make them doubt it. By the time Louise Peete settled once again into her new existence, she had mastered the illusion of virtue. She had learned how to make every smile look genuine, every tear seem real, and every sin appear justified. To the people of Los Angeles, she was no longer a criminal freshly accused of murder. She was a woman wronged by fate, misunderstood by the courts, and bravely rebuilding a life among those who'd never known her darkness. But beneath the soft-spoken widow lived a mind that thrived on deception, a restless spirit addicted to control, and a hunger that no prison could starve. Louise Peete had always understood that people believed what they wanted to believe. And in that era, the early 1940s, when the city was buzzing with optimism and the country was gearing up for war, people desperately wanted to believe in redemption stories. The newspapers were filled with heroes, soldiers, and second chances. And in the midst of that hope, Louise found her perfect camouflage. After her release, she didn't slink into obscurity as most would. Instead, she re-entered society with a strange confidence, even grace. She took a small home near the South Side, blending effortlessly into the quiet neighborhoods where women traded recipes and men read their papers on front porches. To her new neighbors, she was Mrs. Peete, a reserved but kind widow who occasionally hosted afternoon teas and spoke fondly of her late husband. No one asked too many questions, because Louise never gave them reason to. She helped with church fundraisers, sent flowers to sick neighbors, and remembered everyone's birthdays. But behind that sweet facade was a woman who never forgot what power felt like, the thrill of manipulating others, of bending their trust until it broke in her favor. Her social circles began to widen again. Among those she met were older widows, businessmen's wives, and retired couples, people with modest wealth, lonely hearts, and an eagerness to believe in friendship. Louise listened to their troubles, offered advice, and gradually positioned herself as someone reliable, someone indispensable. It wasn't long before one of those friendships took root, with a gentle woman named Margaret Logan. Louise had met her years earlier, before her second downfall, and fate, it seemed, had looped their lives back together. Margaret, grieving and alone, was delighted to find her dear friend again. She invited Louise to stay with her for a while, just until she got back on her feet. And once again, Louise slipped into a home that wasn't hers, wearing that mask of care and devotion that had served her so well. To the outside world, she was a companion, loyal, respectful, selfless. But inside those walls, the manipulation began again. She took control of household routines, bank errands, even the smallest domestic choices. Margaret was older, slower, easy to influence. Louise handled the bills. She managed the correspondence. And just like before, she began to blur the lines between what was hers and what belonged to her host. But what made this chapter of her life different was not just her lies. It was her ability to live two lives at once. By day, she was the perfect housekeeper, the reformed widow, the model of patience and civility. By night, she slipped into the city's undercurrents, the taverns and back alleys where secrets traded faster than money. There were whispers that she was involved with small-time hustlers, that she used her refined image to gather information about properties, about inheritances, about lonely men looking for companionship. No one could prove it, but the rumors lingered like smoke. Louise had always been drawn to danger. It gave her a sense of control, of superiority, and she played her parts perfectly. To the church ladies, she was a quiet, grieving woman who found solace in good deeds. To her underworld acquaintances, she was Lou, the clever one who could talk her way out of anything. Some nights, she'd dress in her finest black gown and attend dinner with respectable couples, her laughter light, her stories modest. Other nights, she'd be seen downtown in shadowy bars, her voice husky, her demeanor commanding. She could shift between worlds effortlessly, and both believed they truly knew her. But this double life took a toll. Maintaining a facade requires constant attention, and cracks began to appear. Her temper flared in small moments when someone questioned her story. She grew paranoid about mail, about phone calls, about who might be watching. The ghost of her past crimes still haunted her, though she'd never admit it. And somewhere in the city, Detective Klein, the one man who had refused to let her disappear into myth, still watched. He'd retired from the force, but not from his obsession. He clipped every article, followed every whisper, and kept her photograph tucked into an old leather notebook. He knew she'd kill again. He just didn't know when. Meanwhile, Margaret Logan's condition worsened. She became weaker, relying more on Louise with each passing week. Louise played the caring friend, spooning soup and reading letters aloud. But there was calculation behind every gesture. She had already taken steps to access Margaret's finances. Insurance policies were updated. Property deeds were adjusted. And when Margaret was too sick to speak, Louise signed on her behalf. Neighbors saw her often now, tending the garden, carrying groceries, chatting pleasantly over the fence. No one suspected a thing. Then, one warm evening, as the sunset bathed the street in orange light, Louise was seen locking the gate behind her. She told a neighbor that Margaret was resting. The next day, she said Margaret had taken ill and needed quiet. Days passed. No one saw Margaret again. Louise explained that her dear friend had gone to a rest home to recover, her tone calm, her story simple. People believed her because why wouldn't they? Louise Peete had perfected the art of the plausible lie, but soon the whispers began again. A neighbor mentioned the smell, faint but unmistakable, coming from the back garden. Another recalled how Louise had been burning something in the fireplace at odd hours. And when Arthur Logan's relative, suspicious of unanswered letters, contacted the police, the calm surface of Louise's perfect world began to ripple. When detectives arrived, she greeted them with her usual poise. "Of course, come in," she said, smiling faintly. Her voice was soft, her demeanor gracious. She guided them through the house, speaking gently about Margaret's illness, about how she'd done her best to care for her. It was only when they stepped into the garden that her smile faltered. The detectives began digging, and within hours the truth, or at least the remains of it, came to light. Louise Peete stood quietly as they unearthed the body. No screams, no denials, no tears. Just that calm, eerie expression that had unnerved so many before. When they asked her to explain, she simply said, "You're mistaken." But she knew it was over. The double life she'd built, the perfect widow and the cunning criminal, had finally collided. The mask had cracked, and beneath it, the monster the world had long suspected finally revealed itself again. That night, as the police car drove her away, the neighbors watched in stunned silence. None of them could reconcile the image of the soft-spoken woman who brought casseroles to church with the killer now in handcuffs. And in that confusion, Louise Peete found a final, perverse satisfaction, because even as her empire of lies crumbled, she had still won. She had still made them believe, and that was her true legacy, deception so deep it could outlive the truth itself. When the officers led Louise Peete out of that quiet South Side home, the air seemed to thicken with disbelief. The neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, clutching their coats and whispering to one another. How could she, the polite, graceful Mrs. Peete, be a murderer? The woman who tended roses and baked lemon pies? It didn't make sense, but behind that charming mask, the truth had always been festering, waiting for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface. Louise sat in the back of the police car, wrists bound, staring out at the city that had once adored her. Los Angeles was a patchwork of neon and smog, of dreams and decay, and she had danced across it like a phantom for decades. Now, as the sirens wailed, she felt none of the panic or remorse the detectives expected. If anything, she looked serene. The calm before another storm she believed she could outlast. At headquarters, the interrogation began the moment she stepped inside. The detectives, hardened men who'd seen the worst of human cruelty, couldn't quite believe what they were facing. Louise Peete wasn't a thug or a gangster's moll. She was articulate, polite, and disturbingly composed. They had questioned murderers who shouted, cried, or broke within minutes. But Louise, she was something else entirely. Detective Klein, older now but sharp as ever, leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing. "You've done this before, haven't you, Mrs. Peete?" Her lips curved faintly. "Done what, detective?" "Killed, lied, buried your mistakes and moved on like they were nothing." She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "You've got quite an imagination." He slammed his palm against the table. "Then tell me where Arthur Logan is." Her gaze didn't waver. "I told you. He went to San Francisco on business. I haven't heard from him since." The room fell silent. Klein exhaled sharply, the weight of years pressing down on him. He chased her ghost for half his career, through different names, different cities, different graves. Each time she slipped away, but this time he swore it would end differently. For days she held firm. No confession, no cracks. The detectives threw evidence at her. Letters with forged signatures, bank withdrawals she couldn't explain, the shallow grave behind the house. She deflected every accusation with the grace of a stage actress. When they confronted her with the discovery of the body, she didn't blink. "That's not Mr. Logan," she said softly, almost kindly, as if explaining something to a child. "You've made a terrible mistake." But the evidence piled higher with each passing day. Fingerprints, financial records, neighbors' statements, even a gardener's testimony claiming he'd been told not to dig in a certain part of the yard. Piece by piece, the facade she'd built began to crumble. Yet what unsettled everyone wasn't her guilt, it was her stillness. Most killers broke down, cursed the law, or wept when cornered. Louise did none of that. She sat through every accusation like someone attending a dull lecture. To the world it looked like madness. To her it was strategy, because in her mind, she was still in control. Louise Peete had survived worse: scandal, imprisonment, isolation. She'd been branded a liar, a thief, even a killer before, and she'd come out the other side untouched. Why should this be any different? She believed she could outthink them again. That if she maintained her charm, played the martyr, and sowed just enough doubt, she might still walk free. The newspapers caught wind of the case, and within days, her name was back in print. Bold headlines screaming across the front pages. Black widow of the South Side, woman accused in shocking murder of employer. The story spread like wildfire. Reporters dug up her past, her first trial, the body of Jacob Denton, and the whispers of other mysterious deaths that had trailed her from city to city. The public was captivated. She wasn't just another criminal. She was a spectacle, a woman who weaponized charm, a predator wrapped in silk and civility, and as much as the attention could have destroyed her, Louise used it. In her cell, she began crafting her next narrative. She played the role of the misunderstood woman once again, the lonely widow who'd only ever tried to help others. She wrote letters to friends claiming she was being persecuted for her past. She smiled for photographers, knowing the world would see the image of a fragile lady wronged by fate. But the detectives weren't swayed. Klein, especially, was relentless. He gathered every scrap of her past, every lie, every shadow of suspicion, and built a case that spanned decades. He called witnesses from her earlier trials, brought in family members of her former victims, and painted a picture so damning that even her most devoted defenders began to hesitate. Still, Louise never broke. When she was brought into the courtroom, she wore a tailored black dress, her hair neatly styled, her demeanor as calm as ever. The reporters described her as serene, almost saintly. The prosecution described her as the most dangerous woman California has ever seen. The trial was theater, dark, twisted, unforgettable. The jury heard of the pattern: widows and men with money, all drawn into Louise's orbit. Trust gained, fortunes transferred, and bodies left behind. They saw the photographs. They read her letters. They listened to the chilling testimony of those who'd nearly fallen under her spell but survived. And still, when she took the stand, she smiled. "I've never harmed anyone in my life," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "If people want to believe otherwise, that's their burden, not mine." It was audacious, infuriating, and somehow mesmerizing. Klein, watching from the gallery, clenched his fists. He'd seen her lie before, but this time the stakes felt higher. He wasn't just hunting justice anymore. He was fighting time itself, ensuring that the ghost of Louise Peete wouldn't haunt another decade of victims. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent. The foreman stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Guilty of murder in the first degree." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire. And in the middle of it all, Louise Peete, unflinching, unreadable, turned her head slightly and smiled. Not a smile of guilt or madness, but of victory. Because even now, in the moment of her final undoing, she had their attention. She owned the room. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment, citing her cold and calculating nature. As they led her away, she turned to Detective Klein. "You've been chasing me a long time, haven't you?" she said softly. He nodded. "And I finally caught you." Her lips curved again, that same eerie calm. "No one ever really catches me, Detective." For a moment, he thought she might be right. Because in that look, in that quiet defiance, he saw something that chilled him more than guilt or rage. He saw belief. Louise Peete didn't see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as the smartest person in the room, the survivor among fools. As the cell door closed behind her for the last time, Los Angeles exhaled. The city had been rid of its queen of deceit, its mistress of charm and death. But her story, her legend, was far from buried. The whispers continued. Some said she'd been framed, others claimed she'd confessed in private. The truth was simpler, darker. Louise Peete's only real confession was her life itself. The trial of Louise Peete wasn't just another courtroom spectacle. It was a collision between illusion and reality. Every lie she had ever told, every mask she had ever worn, was dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. But even then, Even as she stood accused of cold-blooded murder for the second time in her life, Louise Peete didn't flinch. She wasn't a woman begging for mercy. She was the performer, stepping once more onto a stage she knew all too well. When the bailiff led her into the courtroom that first morning, every head turned. The murmurs ceased. There she was, the so-called Queen of the South Side, the charming widow who'd turned Los Angeles high society into her personal hunting ground. Dressed in an immaculate dark suit with a pearl brooch pinned neatly at her collar, she didn't look like a killer. She looked like someone who might run a church luncheon or host a bridge game for charity, and that was her weapon. The jurors, ordinary men and women, found themselves studying her face, her hands, the calm way she carried herself. Reporters described her as the picture of composure, graceful under pressure, even tragically misunderstood. Louise knew how to command attention. She had done it all her life. And now, in a courtroom thick with judgment, she used that power again. But this time, the prosecution came prepared. District Attorney Fred Hauser stood before the jury and painted a picture so vivid it made the room feel colder. He spoke of a woman who thrived on deceit, who had lived by exploiting trust and manipulating kindness. He told them about Jacob Denton, the man buried in his own basement 20 years before. He told them about Arthur and Margaret Logan, 2 more souls swallowed by her greed. She is not merely guilty of murder, Hauser declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. She is guilty of perfection, perfect deceit, perfect cruelty, and perfect calculation. Louise didn't react. Her eyes remained steady, her lips faintly curved. If anything, she seemed amused by the performance. When her defense attorney rose to speak, she tilted her head ever so slightly, as if adjusting her invisible crown. Her lawyer argued that she was a scapegoat, a woman with a tragic past being punished for coincidence. He painted her as someone who had simply been in the wrong place, with the wrong people, at the wrong time. Mrs. Peete, he said, has been a victim of malicious gossip and moral hysteria. She is no monster. She is a woman. Louise dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief at just the right moment. Some of the spectators whispered. Was it possible? Could she really have been misunderstood all these years? But then came the witnesses. One by one, they stepped forward. Neighbors, bank clerks, old acquaintances. Their testimonies were damning. They spoke of missing funds, of strange behavior, of letters that didn't sound like the people who supposedly wrote them. And then came the gardener, the man who'd been ordered not to dig near the back of the house. His words filled the room with a silence so thick it felt like a noose. She told me to leave that patch alone, he said, his voice trembling. Said she had plans for it. I didn't think much at the time, but now, I wish I had. Louise didn't even blink. When the prosecution presented photographs from the Logan home, the freshly turned soil, the evidence of a gunshot wound, the falsified documents, they expected emotion, shock, anger, denial. But Louise only sighed softly, as if disappointed in the world for misunderstanding her genius. Her attorney tried desperately to steer the case back to sympathy. He had her take the stand, a risky move, but one she insisted on. She wanted to speak for herself. And when she did, the courtroom fell under her spell once more. I have spent my life helping others, she began, her voice smooth, steady, almost motherly. I have cared for the sick, comforted the lonely, and endured great loss myself. People see what they want to see, and they have chosen to see evil where there was only kindness. It was hauntingly effective. For a brief moment, even some of the jurors looked uncertain, but the prosecutor was ready. When his turn came to cross-examine, he stepped forward with quiet precision. Mrs. Peete, he asked, how many people have died after taking you into their homes? The question hung in the air like a blade. She smiled faintly. I wouldn't know, he pressed harder. Jacob Denton, Margaret Logan, Arthur Logan, and others whose names we may never know. Are you saying that's all coincidence? She met his gaze without fear. People die, Mr. Hauser. That's life. There it was, the crack in her composure. The faintest edge of arrogance that turned sympathy into suspicion. The jury watched her closely now, not as a fragile woman, but as something far colder. The charm was still there, but it no longer hid the shadow beneath. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture every word, every flicker of expression. For the public, this was more than a trial, it was theater. The glamorous, manipulative widow who'd charmed her way through decades of deceit was finally being stripped bare before them. Outside, the city pulsed with fascination. Newsstands sold out of papers carrying her story. Radio hosts debated her guilt. Some called her a monster, others called her a genius. But everyone agreed on one thing. Louise Peete had become an icon of evil, one who smiled as she fell. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The room she left behind felt heavy, as if her presence lingered in the air. Hours passed. Then, a verdict. When the jurors returned, they couldn't meet her eyes. The foreman's voice trembled as he read the words that would end her long reign of deceit. Guilty of murder in the first degree. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters darted for the doors, their headlines already forming. Louise Peete stood motionless. No tears, no pleas. Just that faint, haunting smile. The same one she'd worn when the police dug up her first victim, when she'd walked free the first time. The judge's gavel struck once. "You are hereby sentenced to death." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the most hardened reporters sat frozen. Death sentences were rare for women, especially in California. But the judge made his reasoning clear. You have lived without conscience. You have taken lives for gain and concealed it beneath charm and false virtue. This court finds no trace of humanity to redeem. As the bailiff took her arm, she finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost kind. "You can't kill me," she said quietly. "People like me never really die." Those words chilled everyone in the room. In the months that followed, as she awaited execution, Louise continued her act. She wrote letters to acquaintances claiming innocence, read her Bible daily, and granted interviews where she insisted the truth would one day clear her name. But deep down, she must have known the curtain was closing for good. Still, even facing death, she refused to show fear. On the day of her execution, witnesses noted that she walked with poise, her steps steady, her expression serene. When asked for final words, she smiled faintly. "No regrets," she whispered, and with that, the queen of the South Side, Louise Peete, the woman who'd outsmarted justice for decades, finally met her end. But the legend she built, the darkness she embodied, would linger long after the prison walls swallowed her name. Because even in death, Louise Peete had what she'd always wanted, to be remembered. When the prison gates closed behind the name Louise Peete, it wasn't just the end of a life. It was the closing of a chapter that haunted Los Angeles for decades. But even in her absence, the echoes of her crimes rippled through the city's veins. People whispered her name in parlors and street corners, in police stations and newsrooms. Louise Peete had become a ghost that refused to fade, a living reminder that beneath the glittering surface of polite society lurked something far darker, far colder. Her story didn't vanish with her execution. It transformed into legend. Newspapers called her the Smile of Death. True crime magazines printed her face beside words like seductress, sociopath, and queen of deceit. Some saw her as a cautionary tale, others as a strange kind of fascination. A woman who wielded charm as a weapon and intellect as her shield. But to those who had crossed paths with her, she was something worse, a curse that left ruin wherever she went. Jacob Denton's relatives, those who had fought for years to clear his name from the lies she had spun, found little comfort in her death. They said justice had come too late. Denton's mansion, the site of her first infamous crime, stood abandoned for years, a hollow shell filled with the memory of greed and betrayal. Neighbors claimed to see lights flickering inside at night, to hear footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Some swore they saw her silhouette in the window, her face half in shadow, half smiling. For those who had once believed in her innocence, the truth left a bitter taste. There were socialites who'd dined with her, investors who'd trusted her, families who'd opened their doors to her lies. To admit they'd been deceived so completely was its own kind of punishment. Many avoided speaking her name altogether, as though silence could erase the humiliation. But law enforcement never forgot her. In the files of the LAPD, her case became a grim study in manipulation and deceit. Detectives would bring it up to rookies, reminding them that evil doesn't always come with a gun in hand. It can come wrapped in silk, with a smile that feels like comfort. Her mugshot, with that faint, unsettling grin, was often used in lectures about the psychology of crime. Remember her, they'd say. She killed without anger, without fear, and without conscience. Psychologists later studied her behavior long after she was gone. Some labeled her a classic sociopath, incapable of empathy, gifted in mimicry, thriving on control. Others argued she was something even more complex, a woman forged by the social boundaries of her time, who learned to weaponize the only tools society allowed her: charm, intellect, and manipulation. Whatever she was, Louise Peete stood as proof that monsters could wear perfume and pearls. The women's prison where she spent her final months never forgot her either. Guards who'd known her spoke of her politeness, her composure. "You'd never think she could harm a soul," one matron said years later. "She used to thank us for small favors. She said please and thank you always. But sometimes she'd look at you too long, like she was studying you, and you'd feel a chill." Her cell remained unoccupied for weeks after the execution. Some said the air inside still carried her scent, a mix of lavender and something metallic, like rust. Eventually, the warden ordered it scrubbed clean and reassigned, but the stories persisted. Prisoners whispered that if you sat in silence, you could still hear her humming, the faint melody of a song she used to sing on quiet nights. Outside those walls, the public's obsession deepened. Hollywood toyed with the idea of turning her story into film, but every attempt faltered. Studios feared her charm would turn audiences sympathetic, and others believed the truth was simply too grim for the screen. Still, she lived on in fiction. Characters inspired by her appeared in noir novels and crime dramas for decades. The femme fatale archetype, the elegant deceiver, the cold-hearted widow, all carried a trace of Louise Peete's legacy. Yet behind all the sensationalism, there was something more profound, a question that lingered in the minds of those who studied her story. How had she survived so long, undetected, unpunished? The answer, perhaps, lay in the very society that condemned her. Louise had understood the power of appearances better than anyone. She had exploited trust, decorum, and the blind spot of gender expectations. In a world that saw women as incapable of such cruelty, she had thrived in plain sight. The irony was cruel but undeniable. The same charm that had shielded her for years became her downfall. Her calm confidence in the courtroom, her refusal to show remorse, stripped away any illusion of innocence. And yet even then she controlled the narrative. When she walked to her death with grace and poise, she ensured she would be remembered not as a broken criminal, but as a figure of chilling composure. In time, the headlines faded. New scandals, new crimes, new faces filled the papers. But every few years her name would resurface, usually when another case echoed her methods. Detectives would shake their heads and say, "Another Peete." It became shorthand for manipulation through charm, for deceit masked by civility. She had become not just a person, but a symbol, and symbols have a way of outliving truth. In the decades that followed, her story took on almost mythic qualities. Some said she had never truly been executed, that she'd bribed her way out and disappeared. Others claimed she'd left behind a hidden fortune, buried somewhere beneath the California soil. Treasure hunters searched her old homes. Reporters chased rumors, but nothing was ever found. It didn't matter. The myth was alive, and that was enough. By the time the century turned, her name had drifted into the archives of forgotten history. But every so often, a writer or historian would resurrect her tale, drawn inevitably to the enigma she embodied. They'd comb through yellowed newspapers, faded photos, and courtroom transcripts, trying to understand how a woman like Louise Peete had managed to live and kill with such calm precision. The answer, perhaps, was that she never stopped performing. Even at her end, she played her part perfectly. The elegant widow, the misunderstood lady, the innocent soul wronged by circumstance. Her lies had been her art, and the world, her audience, had applauded right up until the curtain fell. If you walk through certain neighborhoods of Los Angeles today, where the old mansions stand half empty and the air smells of orange blossoms and rain, you might hear stories about a woman who once lived among them. They'll tell you she was beautiful, well-spoken, always polite. They'll tell you she could make anyone trust her, even as she sharpened the knife behind her back. And if you pass one of those old houses after dark, when the lights are low and the wind rattles the window panes, you might catch a glimpse of her reflection, a faint smile in the glass, a figure watching from the corner of the room. Some say she's still looking for her next home, her next story, her next believer. Because people like Louise Peete don't really die, they just change their shape. In the final years of her life, before the cold dawn of execution day arrived, Louise Peete was a woman suspended between two worlds. The one she left behind, the glittering salons, the sweet perfume of deception, the clinking of glasses and the whispers of money, had long since vanished. In its place stood concrete walls, the clang of cell doors, and the quiet hum of isolation. Yet somehow she still carried herself as if she were the queen of the South Side, walking through her palace rather than a prison. To the guards, she was an enigma. To the inmates, she was a ghost wrapped in silk. She never wept, never begged, never raised her voice, even when they whispered about her crimes, the murders, the manipulation, the trail of death that stretched across states. Louise only smiled that same strange, polite smile. It wasn't pride, nor was it madness. It was as if she knew something they didn't. As if the world had already played its final card and she'd somehow won anyway. In her letters to acquaintances outside the prison, she maintained her facade of innocence. She wrote of peace, of redemption, of faith. But between the lines there was something else, something that hinted at the unrepentant mind that had guided her through decades of deceit. "I have lived a most interesting life," she wrote in one of her final notes. Some would call it tragic, others extraordinary. But it was mine entirely. Those words captured her essence perfectly. Louise Peete had always been the architect of her own fate. She didn't stumble into darkness by accident. She built it, brick by brick, using charm as mortar and death as design. The night before her execution, the prison was unusually still. Rain pattered softly against the windows, and the scent of wet earth seeped into the cold corridors. The warden later recalled how eerily calm she seemed. She refused her last meal, saying she wasn't hungry, and instead asked for a small mirror. She spent the evening brushing her hair, smoothing her dress, making sure every strand was in place. She looked like she was preparing for a dinner party, one matron remembered. Not her own execution. When the guards came for her just before sunrise, Louise rose gracefully from her bed, smiled faintly, and said, "Let's not keep them waiting." Her voice carried no tremor, no hesitation. She walked through those halls as she had walked through life, with quiet confidence, as though every step was hers to command. As she entered the chamber, she paused for a moment and looked at the people gathered. The warden, the guards, the witnesses. Her eyes moved from face to face, calm and unblinking. One witness later said he felt as if she could see straight through him, reading his thoughts, judging his fear. Then she smiled, a small, haunting curve of her lips that would linger in their memories for the rest of their lives. When the switch was thrown, Louise Peete didn't flinch. The woman who had lived a life built on lies and death left this world as she had entered it, quietly, elegantly, and on her own terms. But her story didn't end there. Within hours of her death, newspapers across the country exploded with headlines. "The Queen of Deceit executed at dawn. Louise Peete goes to her death calmly." Some articles painted her as a monster, others as a tragic figure of wasted brilliance. Radio hosts debated her legacy, psychologists analyzed her mind, and housewives clipped her picture from the paper, whispering over their morning coffee, "How could she do it? How could she live with herself?" That question, the one no one could answer, became her legacy. The mansion where Jacob Denton's body had been found was eventually sold, but no one stayed there long. Tenants complained of strange sounds, footsteps in empty rooms, faint laughter at night, the smell of perfume drifting through the halls. Some said they saw her reflection in the windows, others claimed to hear the rustle of silk in the dark. The house developed a reputation as cursed property. No matter how many times it was renovated, it never felt like home. It felt haunted. Over time, her name became synonymous with elegant evil. Detectives studying cold cases would mention her in hushed tones, comparing her to new suspects. "This one's got a Pete look about her," they'd say. She had become a template for deceit, a living myth that blurred the line between humanity and horror. Decades later, criminologists began revisiting her case, digging through old police reports, letters, and testimony. What they found was chilling. Every stage of her life followed a pattern, a calculated rhythm of manipulation, death, and reinvention. She'd moved from city to city like an actress changing costumes, crafting a new persona each time. Wealthy widow, grieving friend, sophisticated guest, And always, behind that mask, the same cold strategist. Some argued she was one of the earliest examples of a female serial killer who used intelligence rather than brute force. Others saw her as a byproduct of her time, a woman trapped in a society that underestimated her, who learned to exploit that blindness for survival. But regardless of theory, one truth remained. Louise Peete defied understanding. She was both the victim and the villain of her own story. Even today, her name surfaces in discussions of criminal psychology. She's mentioned alongside figures like Belle Gunness and Nanny Doss, women who turned the domestic sphere into a hunting ground. But unlike them, Louise's crimes carried a different flavor. There was no rage, no impulsive violence, only calculation, control, the quiet satisfaction of knowing she held all the cards. Her story has been retold in documentaries, podcasts, and dark corners of the internet where true crime enthusiasts trade details like secrets. But none can fully capture what made her so unnerving. It wasn't just that she killed, it was that she did so while smiling. She lived in two realities, one for the world to see, and one where only she ruled. In the end, maybe that was her true empire, not built from money or power, but from illusion. She made people believe what she wanted them to believe, and in that, she was invincible, at least for a time. The legend of Louise Peete endures not because of the number of her victims, but because she forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, dresses well, and says please and thank you. Even now, long after her name has faded from the front pages, there are moments when her presence seems to flicker back into existence, when a smile in an old photograph seems just a little too knowing, or when a story about charm turned deadly hits the news, and someone mutters, "Another Pete." Some ghosts are born of tragedy, others of violence. But Louise Peete's ghost was born of elegance and lies, and perhaps that's why it still lingers quietly, waiting for the next person willing to believe the beautiful lie. As the camera fades to black, her voice seems to echo one last time, soft, calm, almost tender. I only did what I had to. The rest, well, that's just what people choose to believe. And with that final whisper, the Queen of the South Side disappears into legend, forever smiling from the shadows.